Thanks everybody for coming. As I hope everybody knows, this is part of the 2013-14 Mobile App Challenge, which is jointly put on by the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship, UChicago Tech, who has graciously donated the $10,000 grand prize, and UChicago IT Services. I'm Warren Streetley from IT Services, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce this panel. A couple of things before we start. Is this great clicker, Cornelia?
Yes.
Am I pressing the right button? No. There we go. Okay, so I said this is who we are. If you haven't gotten to work on your submission for the app challenge, the deadline is November 17th, so it's coming quickly, and we're running ahead of the number of applicants we had at a similar point last year. Last year we got a total of 113 applications. We're looking to beat that this year, so please get us all your good ideas. A couple of upcoming speaker sessions that are also going to be interesting. We have Louis Gillian and James Taylor, not the singer, talking about their experience using mobile to enhance patient experiences and decision making. That's coming up next Friday. And mobile technology and the law of market information parity, whatever that means, but sounds interesting, by Adam Gerber from computer science. So both of those should be interesting. We ask that you RSVP just so we have some idea of how many people are coming. If you don't RSVP, don't let that be an impediment to just showing up. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Scott Stern, who will moderate the panel, and he'll take it from here.
Thanks, Oren. We're going to, let me tell you the structure of what we're going to do, and I'll make a brief introductory remark. Briefly, we've got a series of questions for the panelists. I thought what I would do is ask a question and let whoever would like to field it first field it, and we'll try to limit comments to no more than 2 minutes, and then let the other panelists comment on the same question before we move on. And that way we can probably keep any given question, somewhat less than 10 minutes and try to get through them. I was asked if I wanted to make any introductory remarks. I'm on the physician side of all this, as well as worked on an app myself. I think from the physician side, this is really a no-brainer in the sense of need. And what drives that need is fairly obvious. First of all, as most of you probably know, there's just literally an information explosion out there of information. The amount of information doctors have to keep in their heads or available to them compared to when I was a medical student is astronomically different. And oftentimes that level of detail that's required is actually not conceivable to keep in your head. And these are decisions that you actually have to make for patients. A couple of examples. If you're deciding whether a woman needs medications for osteoporosis, there's actually something called a FRAX score you need a calculator for. If you're going to order a CAT scan on a patient and you're trying to decide what's their risk of having a renal injury from that contrast dye, there's a calculator that gives that information. There's a ton of information about all the drugs out there. What are their side effects? How do they interact? Is this going to be good or bad for your patients? And so on and so forth. And so the amount of information is just mind-boggling, and it's impossible to keep it in your head. And yet malpractice suits are often raised because someone didn't keep one particular piece of information in their head out of the 10 million pieces of information that might be out there. So it's clear that something that is readily available and easy to use is absolutely required for physicians. The other part that feeds into this is, of course, money and time. So you may have heard there's kind of a healthcare problem. I understand, and we're spending too much money on healthcare, and so no one's actually coming to the doctors and saying, can we give you more money for your services? We think you deserve more than you get. No one's ever said that, and I don't see that coming in the near future. So that's going to require the doctors are efficient, use their time wisely, and all that also requires technology. So I think you put all that together, the need is crystal clear, and the question is how do we optimize it, how do we take advantage of it, how do we make patient care better? Brian and I were just talking about patients who have kidney disease being put on certain medications to protect their kidneys. And to us in medicine, at least at the University of Chicago, that's a no-brainer. We know that information. None of my colleagues would blink at seeing that information, and yet Brian tells me out in the community, doctors often stare at him kind of blankly when he mentions this. So it's clear that we need to do this better to deliver the type of care that patients actually assume that they're getting, that they're often, I would say usually, not getting. So with that introduction, why don't we start off with our questions? Were you going to say anything different about the panelists? Warren?
Why don't we each take a second?
Yeah, if we could each take a minute. Brian, go ahead.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Brian Coe. I am currently the Chief Executive Officer of a company called SlipChip Corporation. SlipChip is a company that I founded with a professor from the University of Chicago 2 years ago named Rustam Ismagilov. He's now left our fair lands and is a professor at Caltech. And and this is actually my entry personally into the mHealth world. So we have little chips, they look like credit cards, and they're made of plastic, and they make highly quantitative measurements of nucleic acids and proteins. So for example, we can do an HIV viral load on a little plastic chip, and we read them with a cell phone. And that information goes to the cloud and comes back with your viral load and the standard error around that measurement. So far, that technology is actually on par with what you would get from a Roche box that's in a giant reference laboratory. So, you know, I'm here with you. I've been doing it a little bit longer, but I'm trying to figure out how this mHealth world is going to function. Backing up, I'll just give you, just as a few background elements to my life. I started a specialty lab called LithoLink, ran that for 11 years. It was for kidney stone patients. Sold it to a company called LabCorp, which is one of the 2 national labs. They do about 10% of the blood testing in North America, and was an executive there for 6 years before starting SlipChip. Oh, and I have an MBA from Booth.
Steve.
So my name is Steve Gould. I'm actually a surgeon by training. I did vascular surgery and trauma. I began my career many years ago at what was then Michael Breeze Hospital a little north of here, and my faculty appointment was in the Department of Surgery here at the University of Chicago, full-time faculty. So I began a very traditional mode. My colleagues and I were doing research that led to our starting back in the 80s a biotech company developing a hemoglobin-based oxygen carrier as a blood substitute. Did that for many years. That phase sort of came to closure in 2009. Since that time, I consult for a number of early stage companies, kind of combining my academic clinical research experience with my entrepreneurial experience. I spend time here presently as an entrepreneur in residence, day or 2 a week in UChicago Tech. I'm pretty involved in lots of activities at Booth and Polsky. And my third bucket is involved in a variety of early stage investing with Bob on my left. We're colleagues, we invest in and look at a number of things together. I'm not directly involved in any apps. I see a lot of them in my various roles of mentoring, looking at potential investments, and as a physician like Scott, I have lots of thoughts on the potential values. I don't want to call myself a skeptic. We'll get into this during the discussion, but I have lots of questions about how we're going to make this work. Enormous potential.
Bob?
Yeah, I'm Bob Zieserl. Kind of break my background in a couple of chunks. I started my career on the provider side at Rush in corporate management. So I really learned the clinical and the management side and the finance side of healthcare. I moved into healthcare IT. That was the second phase of my career. Everything from EMR systems through pharmacy lab and other systems, largely enterprise scale, institutional based. I then moved from there into funding and operating companies in medical imaging, primarily three-dimensional cardiovascular imaging and diagnostics, and then moved into devices. For about the last 12 years or so, I've been kind of a hybrid of entrepreneur, venture capitalist, private investor, and mentor. In 2007, I became involved as an investor and board member of a company called VG Bio that has taken technology that was originally developed at Argonne National Labs, commercialized through UC Tech, initially in the commercial marketplace and rotating machinery, and began a process of applying it to healthcare. The core technology of the company is multivariate analytics, a specific variant of that. We determined that in order to demonstrate that we could actually apply it to healthcare, we had to build our own device to collect data from multiple signals. Fortunately, we were able to get SBIR funding and then VA funding to do that. We built a product. It is focused on chronic diseases, primarily on heart failure at this point. It is being tested here at University of Chicago as well as at the VA, and is not FDA approved, but is on the path to that. The company hopes to morph over time to being a pure analytics company and use the analytics as a service model to support a wide variety of apps.
Thanks. David.
So I'm Dave Beiser. I'm an emergency physician at University of Chicago. I've been here for about 10 years, primarily doing cardiovascular research, basic science in the lab, type of stuff with mice. But I also have a couple clinical program research projects that I run. Prior to medical school, I was an engineer and I developed a variety of orthopedic electromechanical systems. I did that for a while, got a little bit kind of disenchanted with the medical products industry because at the time it just seemed like we were kind of developing vitamins, things that we didn't necessarily really need, but were increasing the cost of care. Got increasingly interested in medicine. Here I am. About 2 years ago, I saw this convergence of mobile technology and kind of large data sets that were freely available, and other levers such as the Accountable Care Act, which you've heard a little bit about in the news the last several weeks, and how these things would really potentially change the landscape of medical technology to the point where we could actually do something good for the patients without, and at the same time potentially lower the cost of care. So that started to be appealing. So since that time, I've kind of retooled a little bit and have been very closely following the mobile health market, and been to, I don't know, a dozen conferences just trying to kind of understand kind of what's going on and talk to a lot of people. What I'm doing currently, I've got a few things going in the mobile health area. We actually started off, we developed an app for last year's mobile app challenge, focused on the discharge process from the emergency department, and that's going forward. So we've got the mobile app there, and I'm also co-founded a company that's focused called Qualia, and we are focused on improving the quality of life in heart failure patients, and so that's a mobile device as well, and so that's my lens that I look at all this through. So.
Thanks. So a very diverse group. It should be interesting to answer some of the questions. I didn't mention the introduction. I was also involved in the mobile, not in the mobile app challenge, but the UC Tech Challenge. So I was part of Agile Diagnosis when that won a couple of years ago. So if anybody wants to talk about that later, I'll be around. So our first question is the following. And what we could do is just open this up to whoever interests you, and then try to keep it to about 2 minutes so the other people can respond. How would you describe the mobile health market and its growth? Go ahead, Steve.
So I want to start with the general comment, some of which we've heard about. So what I see, again, as a non-active participant, but an observer, we have the convergence of the following things. David mentioned we have this expansion of mobile technology, which makes it easy to do these things. We have the Accountable Care Act, which you can't ignore. We have not been able to ignore it for years, and it's now front and center because of the challenges of getting it underway. And we have this enormous focus from all angles on improving care for patients, as Scott mentioned. That's tied to physicians wanting to do good for their patients. It's tied to the winners in healthcare reform that are going to be those that can improve outcomes and reduce costs. So it's improvement in quality and prevention. So I think there are sort of three goals. The pure one, the University of Chicago goal, would be to do good for mankind. Right? We're going to improve things. Second goal, and there's nothing wrong with that, the Booth goal would be to make money. There's nothing wrong with that in America, right? But I make the analogy of the Wild West because we have the widespread availability of all this stuff. everybody's trying to get in on the game, and there are very few, as I think we'll find out today, that have really solved the problems. So as a generic challenge, that's what I see happening, and the reasons behind the growth. Success is a whole other story, which we'll get into.
So a couple of comments to kind of build on that. You know, when you talk about mobile health, there's mobile wellness and mobile health, right. And they're different. You can talk about who the user is. You know, oftentimes it's the individual or the patient, if they actually call themselves the patient. You can then think about whether it's focused on compliance or whether it's providing data to them. Most of the data apps are single data source at this point. Some of them are starting to integrate data from other sources, but that's really in its nascent form. Then you've got the notion of apps that are prescribed by the physician, and there are very, very few of those. When you talk about where there's going to be huge potential to contribute, it will be the physician that prescribes the app for the patient, and then there's an intersection between the physician and the patient around the data and beginning to transform and enable the patient more self-management, but also a linkage into the healthcare system. And in terms of the growth, I think on the health side, there's a huge opportunity there.
I have to say, I've never thought of that before, but that's a really interesting idea. David, did you want to comment?
So I guess I would describe it, many of the apps that I've seen are somewhat superficial. We've got two different sides. We've got wellness and we've got kind of health. And right now, there's an arbitrary kind of separation between the two. I see them merging very quickly, where these kind of wellness companies, fitness companies, for example, are kind of edging a little bit towards health, and the health folks are edging a little bit towards fitness. And so it's kind of blurry, but specifically in the mobile health market, a lot of the stuff that I've seen isn't really designed for my patients at this point. Primarily designed for, like hipsters with chronic disease. Okay, and so I think that's the big challenge that I think we have in front of us, is that we need to design stuff that really is kind of ready to kind of, not the vitamins, the stuff that's really going to improve the health of our patients, and that's going to require finding out, how our patients interact with technology. It's going to require us to figure out how our patients frame their disease, and what do they really need. So much of it's coming from the top, physicians saying, "Oh, I think this is a good idea. It's an easy app." That's on the patient-facing side. I think on the physician-facing side, I think the apps are actually a lot better. Okay, so the apps that I have available to me are many of them are great, and we can get into this a little bit later. And I think that's primarily because they're being designed with a lot of physician input. But I think the patient-facing apps right now are not really kind of getting in there and observing the patients and really finding out what they need, with a few exceptions, which we can get into later, perhaps.
And I'll just say, I mean, from my perspective, I think this whole area is exploding. It's really exciting, and it's exploding for a lot of reasons. First of all, what you can do on these platforms, this will be obvious to many of you, is totally changed, and it's changing rapidly. The graphics are better, the information that's on these devices is better, and their interconnectivity between devices has changed. You have to, for mobile health, to ultimately where it has to go, right, it has to be able to find out what exists in other electronic repositories and convey that somewhere, in many cases, not in all cases. And if you look sort of at some of the things that, I don't use it myself, but originally applications like UpToDate. Can you get UpToDate? Can you look things on? This is a almost like a how-to manual for doctors. Like, I have somebody with chronic kidney disease. Can I go look at the guidelines? Can I see what the latest thing is? Can I keep current? And that's going to change to, in my view, how do you think about molecular diagnostics? And if you have sequencing done in some remote location or some part of the world, can that connect to an information system that tells you what that sequence means and what to do with that information? And so, I think it's a very exciting area. I think it's going to grow quickly. I see every parties ranging from physicians to the Department of Defense to hospital systems. All of them are very interested in how do we take advantage of this technology. And the challenge for all of you is to think about what's useful that you can do with this.
Pulling your comments together, there's an interesting kind of conundrum that goes on, which is, on the one hand, there's apps for physicians that physicians want, and on the other hand, there's apps for patients. From a market perspective, if Steve was, mentioned from the booth side, clearly most of the money would be driven by what patients want, because,
Right.
And also things that affect lots of patients are, of course, have a much bigger economic potential than things that affect a few patients. The funny part about that is, of course, what physicians need most to have the most impact is to affect the sick patients, and there's fewer of them with any particular disease. And so in some senses, I think one of the challenges will be making the financial ends of these apps work where it really has an impact. That is on the sick patient with heart failure. Well, heart failure is common, but if we take a lot of other diseases which are much less common, how do we create a market that actually works and supports those apps? And maybe the federal government, with its push to improve healthcare in general, will end up supporting them because they affect outcomes. But there is this kind of tension between what physician needs to really affect outcomes and what patients like, especially healthy patients, because there's tens of millions of them, that makes a lot of money. We should probably move on to the next question. So are there special issues that relate to medical apps that would distinguish them from non-mobile applications, such as issues of monetization, FDA regulation? We actually face that with Agile. Mobile health care apps, equipment compatibility, and any special problems with the consumers. So when you compare these apps to others, how would you think about them? Go ahead, Brian.
Well, so one of the big things that you have to deal with in clinical care is, and I mentioned this just a second ago, but it's access to information. How do you acquire the information that's relevant for that patient? So it doesn't help you, for instance, to suggest that somebody might need a blood pressure medication if they're already taking the medication, or to ask about whether some disease might be present when it's already well known that it is. So how do you get that information to this mobile device? And depending on the uses, there could be a wide range of information you need, ranging potentially from it's just pushed from the device to the device actually has some ability to understand what you're asking for and to acquire the information. The second thing that I would say is a big challenge is all of these devices and all of the users are very, very different. And many times, it's, the device may not be, all the hardware might change. Is it capable? Is it, does this device on this network talk to this structure to get the information? And can it do so reliably? And then the third broader issue, I think, is as you start putting more and more information into consumers' hands, we could talk all day about a lot of these issues, but how do you think about curating that data? How do you understand what is and isn't useful to give to people, and what action has been taken? I think those, I'll pass it off to my colleagues here, but those would be a few areas I would look at.
So I want to talk about the FDA.
Go ahead.
I think that's a huge issue. So I spent many, many years interacting with the FDA as a, quote, sponsor trying to develop the product I mentioned. Today I am what's called an SGE, a special government employee. It's essentially a consultant to the Blood Products Advisory Committee, so I have lots of FDA experience. The FDA recently issued their sort of guidance on mobile apps, and if you read it, it's not really conclusive. The reason is they don't know. My own opinion now is that they're going to be more involved rather than less involved as we go forward, because many of these apps, FDA, their primary focus is on protecting the population in the United States, right? And many of these apps have the potential to improve care, certainly based on physician hospitals. The concern is, are you going to proactively initiate something that could be damaging and inappropriate, or are you going to miss something and get a sense of security? So in my mind, there's no question that they will get involved regulating these. I don't know how that's going to work, if they're going to evolve to where they want data in the same manner that they do for therapeutics. But I think that's a big issue going forward. So, you have experience of that with Agile, which you can talk about.
Well, it'd be one-liner. We just basically tried to find out, as you said, what
Right.
the FDA impact was going to be. And just like you said, it's
Right.
yet unclear.
Right. So it's good to be out in front of it, but what I tell folks is hope that you don't, but just assume that you're going to have to deal with them because it's better to be prepared.
Bob?
So we're really in the infancy of exploring what we can do with a smartphone. I mean, when you think about the power in a smartphone, it's mind-boggling in comparison to where we were 10, 20 years ago. So what can we do now? We can do a 2-lead ECG on a phone. There are apps that are purporting to identify arrhythmias off of that. There's now an application where you ingest a pill that transmits data from a sensor that is a vegetable sensor to a transdermal patch you wear that then transmits that to your cell phone, and it has blood pressure and a variety of other pieces of data. And you can go on from there. There are also apps, by the way, on the laboratory side, not only for the U.S., but also for rural Africa, where you're not connected to the cellular network, where you're doing laboratory diagnostics on a cell phone. And these are about to come out into the marketplace. Those are the kind of apps that the FDA is going to have to really grapple with, and companies are going to have to really educate the FDA about. And then you have to deal with how much of the data goes to the user or the patient, and how much of that data goes to the physician. And there are now some apps that are in development where the data, in addition to patient-entered data, is actually the application on the mobile phone is recommending to the patient how to titrate medications, and then after that recommendation, refer that to the physician. So it's in the EMR. That's not approved, by the way, but that has been developed and is in clinical trial.
That gives me chest pain. David?
Well, so yeah, I guess I would chunk it into, as Brian said, issues of input and interoperability between systems, FDA and HIPAA. On the input side, that's a major challenge. It's a major challenge with electronic medical records as well. Input right now is the thing that slows me down. The EMR has increased the amount of time that I document probably at least by 25%. Okay, so it has not been a time saver at all. I've got much deeper information than I ever did before, but I spent a lot more time inputting. Okay, that's completely broken with a keyboard. It's seriously broken on here, right? Because I can't do much input unless I've got a great sensor like Brian's SlipChip that's doing this great input, basically leveraging the photo diode. With the FDA, yeah, so they recently issued their final guidance on mobile health applications, and it does appear that there's certain things that they're saying, at least at this point, they're not going to look at. So they're not going to look at apps that help patients organize their own health data, for example, EMRs, or personal health records on mobile apps. They're really not going to scrutinize very closely. So if you're communicating information to your health provider, probably not going to be looked at. But other things that kind of transform your phone into something that looks like a regulated device, so an app that turns your phone into a 2-lead ECG, for example, that's going to be that's a regulated device. If it kind of turns your phone into part of a glucometer, for example, that's regulated. Or if it kind of transforms data, so take vital sign data and you do something to it, and make kind of a suggestion about what you should do in response to that vital sign, that's starting to be regulated. And they're a little grayer in that area. With HIPAA, there's a huge issue with kind of HIPAA, which is the kind of the Information Privacy Act that we all suffer under, and it's a huge issue, right? And once you start having medical professionals, and believe me, almost every physician has one of these in our hospital, okay? And guess what? There's patient information on all of these. They used to be, all the patient information was on our pagers, okay? And that wasn't very secure at all, right? The pagers aren't even password protected. But now there's patient information on everybody's phone, I would venture to guess, okay? And we use it all the time. And so once we get into this kind of this situation where the medical center is no longer providing us with our most useful computational tool, that it's a BY, like bring your own device kind of atmosphere, okay, where everything is everybody's bringing their own thing to the table. That gets really difficult for a medical center to control that, okay? And that's one of the big issues right now, I think, in mobile health, is how to kind of best control that, because that's the way it has to be, right? Everybody's going to be using this as their primary computational tool. So that's it. And then a lot of the data that is being collected off these tools are going to cloud database storage type systems that aren't necessarily HIPAA compliant. That's a problem. And then obviously the wireless transmission and its encryption standards. And that's, that's where how I would kind of lay it out.
I think one thing that separates the mobile market out from some of the rest of the market is that we can reach the rest of the world and leapfrog. So in many parts of the world there are cell phones, but there's not computers. And so you can start to think about problems that previously you couldn't have addressed in many parts of the world because there isn't the technology there, but there is cell phones there. And so when you think in the big picture, and you're outside the United States, you can also think about invading spaces and leapfrogging technologies, because now they do have that ability to communicate.
Well, it's a leapfrogging technology on the south side of Chicago, right? So there's not a lot of connectivity, landline connectivity with my patients. But guess what? My patients, they all have one of these, okay? And we're actually doing a tech survey right now. We're almost done with it, actually. And we now know how they use these. What exactly they're carrying. Do they have data plans? Do they use health information? Do they use these to access health information? So it's a leapfrogging technology, I think, in Chicago.
Cool. All right, next question is kind of interesting. Gentlemen, what's the hottest area right now in mobile tech for healthcare? I'm sure a lot of people in the room want to hear the answer to this. And what are some of the most impressive and promising apps in that space? So why don't we do reverse? David, I'll let you go first this time.
The hottest
The hottest thing.
Well, I think the one that gets, so I think I'm very interested in how these interact with sensors, whether it's Brian's SlipChip, whether it's the two lead ECG.
ECG is electrocardiogram.
Sorry,
they're not medical.
Glucometers. I think you think about this idea that, well, we've had glucose pumps for a long time. We've had glucose meters for a while. They haven't been connected. And they certainly haven't been connected in a mobile sense. Well, now they are, okay? So that's essentially an artificial pancreas. Once you have continuous glucose monitoring and some type of like mobile computational power, and then you have a way to actually regulate insulin levels, that's really transformative to a lot of patients. So I think, for me at least, it's apps that interact with the physical world.
And just to add on that, then in theory, you can then affect patients' care constantly instead of the intermittent. Our current thought, healthcare is delivered episodically now, right? So you go to your doctor, and once every 3 months, he says, change your Lasix dose. Whereas if you had an app that could somehow send somebody's volume state and could give them day-to-day or hour-to-hour instruction on medications, it'd be a different world. Yeah. Bob?
Well, I want to kind of build on that, and I'd kind of redefine the question a little bit. It's kind of like what I would call the emerging hottest spaces, because if you look at what's out there now and what people are downloading and buying and what have you, most of it's wellness, and most of the health apps are relatively soft in terms of information. With the sensor data, what I think we can start to really attack are the two huge winners in this space, and it's chronic disease management. That's where we spend the majority of the money. That's where you can fundamentally impact people's lives, everything from diabetes through COPD through patients with acute asthma. You can go right on down the list. And the other, which is, I think going to be harder, but is also a part of chronic disease management, is patient compliance. I mean, the fundamental issue that every physician deals with and their staff is, not just the diagnosis, but getting the patient to be compliant. And I think there's a huge opportunity because of what you just said, this feedback loop, not only to the clinician, but the feedback loop to the patient.
So I also want to slightly modify the question to answer what do I think is the greatest opportunity. And once again, Scott and Dave have talked about chronic disease. And as a surgeon, I actually was attracted to surgery because when I was doing medicine as a medical student, which I thought was the most intellectually stimulating and challenging, I started to learn actually very few things where we cure patients. They have these chronic diseases. So you have two states. You're either compensated or decompensated. And I think on the chronic disease, which Scott touched on, the goal is to avoid patients decompensated congestive heart failure requiring hospitalization. So I think the opportunity is building on using the sensor data to continuously or intermittently gather this information and then combine with some sort of predictive analytics that Bob talked about earlier to identify people. And I don't know if we can do this. The data are not there yet. To identify a patient at risk of decompensating and intervene. That's one. The other one that is comparable was actually in the hospital. So patients who are hospitalized for whatever reason, they may be previously healthy who come in with an acute problem, things like myocardial infarction in the hospital, things like sepsis, same basic goal, gather data on an ongoing basis and integrating it in a way that we as physicians don't do as effectively and in real time as we could. Both of them are designed to predict the onset of a catastrophic event and avoid those. And that will again come back to the two goals. We're going to improve outcomes and save money if we do that.
Brian.
Well, first of all, I got to say I really like all three of those answers a lot because I think together they're very much things that I personally think are incredibly important. Dave's comments about sensors, absolutely. How do you collect information? And then how do you? Then Bob's comment about chronic disease. How do you manage it? Absolutely. And then Steve thinking about how do you incorporate analytics? And I think these things to have changes in behavior and to kind of push that back to where the mobile device is, I think is also incredibly important. And if you kind of think broadly, you can envision a world where there's a pandemic. I think pandemics are a very interesting application for mobile health. Not the biggest one, but interesting. Can you look and see somewhere in some remote part of the world and get a photo of what's going on? Can you actually collect information? Can you transport that information? What if you want to collect information in 50 locations, whether it's in South Florida or Angola? How do you get that information to a centralized location, and how do you then inform people what to do with that information? So those things are all, I would say, tremendously exciting areas. And one of the things that I think, part that I'll just as a last comment is part of this is really a matter of taste and objective, right? So this platform is huge. All these great things are coming, and as you think about what's hottest, part of it is this is just nascent, it's just burgeoning now, and what's hottest to each of you, and what are you interested in bringing these methods to bear against? And if you give that some thought, I think you'll see there's a lot of opportunity.
Scott, I got a double dip.
Please.
We have to mention Google Glass, all right?
Yes.
And just as far as a provider-facing app, and I think we're starting to see a lot of applications come out, whether it's enhancing Steve's ability to perform surgery by allowing him to pull up images, from a CT scan, to my ability to, track a patient's lab in a rapidly evolving situation in the emergency department. So a lot of apps are kind of arriving, and you're starting to hear about them. And so Google Glass, a sensor, if you will, but much more so a display and input kind of device.
I'm going to skip a question because we have a lot of time. I want to make sure we get to this one because I think the audience would like to hear it. What's the biggest mistake people can make when it comes to desiring mobile solutions for healthcare? I mean, there's a lot of combined experience at this table, and as we advise them, are there some areas that aren't mobilizable? Are there some things that are particularly difficult? Are there some, what have you learned in your time in healthcare? So go ahead, Bob.
So one of the things we haven't talked about yet today is to envision what the future looks like and I'm not a clinician, but if I can take the part of a clinician, when your patients are using mobile apps and collecting data, that data is going to come into your practice. And the ability to discriminate between normal data and abnormal data is going to be a huge problem when you replicate that with millions and millions of people streaming data in. And the way I think about it, one of the Achilles heels of this entire field, when you start talking about linking physicians and patients taking more responsibility, is an analytic method of discriminating between normals and abnormals and escalating the abnormals in a scalar way so you can get attention. Because the healthcare system's not going to incent economically physicians and other clinicians to look at all this information. There's no way they can do that. And it really takes wrapping your brain around that scale and thinking about it, and I think there's a huge opportunity there.
Yeah, I completely agree that information overload for the physician and potentially the patient as well is one of the Achilles heels. The other thing that I would say, kind of from a mistake standpoint, is that a lot of this information is being supplied either to the physician or the patient at not the right time. So you need to provide information to me, about a patient when I'm ready to act on a patient, or ready to do something with a patient. So finding the right context to deliver that information is very important. And if you like, or at least tolerate, the BJ Fogg kind of view of the world of what it takes to actually get people to act, the information needs to arrive at the right moment in time along that kind of care pathway. So it needs to be integrated into the care pathway in a way that's not disruptive, does not increase my information overload that I already suffer from.
Steve, did you want to say anything about mistakes?
Just briefly, it touches on some of this. I think it's lack of sufficient forethought before people develop the app. And it goes back to my opening comment. Just because it's so easy to do these things, we're seeing a lot of them that are unlikely to be successful.
Brian, did I get to you or no?
No, but
go ahead.
I can throw. I mean, honestly, Steve hit the exact thing that I was going to say, which is just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, or that it's a good business idea or it's a good medical idea.
Right.
And it's exactly your point. And I think the biggest thing that is that, and then the other things that we've talked about, how hard it is to get the relevant information. You can assume, don't make assumptions like, oh, and we'll just tap into Epic and all this information will populate my cell phone and like magic we'll have all this great information. It's going to be really hard to do that maybe.
Make sure
one example of where this more information is not good is, I think, if you look at the prescriptions that everyone gets from Walgreens, now computer databases hand all that information to you. Well, more of my patients are confused by that information than helped by it by far, because it doesn't discriminate between what's really important for them to know and what's not, and it's truly overwhelming. And so that's an example, it could be in the mobile space or not, of where the natural assumption is more information is better. I will tell you, on the physician side, more information to patients is not always in their best interest, to be honest. It might sound heretical, but it's true nonetheless. Okay, so why don't we do another question, then maybe should we open it up, maybe, Oren, to some questions? All right. Why don't we do this as our last formal question, then we'll open up. As you participate in this space, what surprised you the most? And what's the toughest problem you've solved today? Any takers?
Well, I mean, on a personal level.
Sure, why not?
On a personal level, in my own SlipChip world, I'm fascinated by the idea that you can actually count HIV viruses on a cell phone. I mean, that's kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy, right? So, and you don't really think you can do these things, but you actually can. And the other thing, I guess, that is really surprising is how fast the amount of information that is available is exploding. I mean, it really is tremendous what can be done, the amount of information that can be generated on sequencers today, the amount of DNA sequence that can come, the amount of phenotypic or qualitative data that also is available. So I'd say those would be the things.
Anybody else?
Well, I think he's hit the accomplishment. I think the toughest problem, again, we've covered, really, it's the integration with other things. Brian mentioned Epic. For those that don't know, Epic is sort of the most commonly used electronic medical record. So it's the integration of these things. And again, I come back to my comment about the problem of not thinking through what you're really trying to do, just because you can do what you're doing.
Well, when you talk about the physician-patient interaction applications, it really is the transformation of the payment system and the regulatory system to begin to understand the opportunity. And that's even despite the fact that the FDA finally has come out with their pronouncement, it's still lagging. I think that's one of the biggest holdbacks in this industry today.
They never figured out how to pay doctors for phone calls, much less figuring out how to work with your patients with various apps. And so all those could have serious improvements in healthcare, but if it doesn't build into the finance system, it often doesn't get incorporated. David, you want to take a last crack at that?
Yeah, I was going to say the toughest problem that I've yet to crack is try to figure out who pays for this.
Yeah.
And this is both in my asthma app and with this startup that I'm working on. And so I can't figure that out. I don't have the training to. The thing that was probably most surprising to me, the technical challenges are all doable, I think. But the thing that was most surprising to me is, I guess, how much I learned through the mobile app challenge. So I was somebody who had not programmed a computer in probably at least 10 years. And going from there to being able to actually develop an app and work in this space. So that was probably the most surprising thing. It was more of a personal kind of journey, and the structure of the mobile app challenge played an integral role. The class that Brian teaches, D4 Lab, or D4 Foundations this year, that also played an integral role for me, just kind of to try to figure out how to innovate in this space. So more of a personal surprise than
I'll mention one surprise and then up for questions. As a non-business person and as a physician, I thought the thing that was most surprising to me in trying to develop apps was the assumption by investors that they were going to do it if the potential for earnings was something like 10 or 20-fold over what they invested. It creates a very high bar for them to jump into the game. So it seems like a no-brainer for something that would definitely make money, might not create the type of investment opportunity that you would think it would invest. And I'm shocked by that, but I guess that's not been my world, so I'm naive.
That's true.
I will echo that, because as med students and physicians, we're always like, we should do that, and we don't think about, we think about the impact on health, but we don't think about the sustainability. I think it's a different model that can potentially be applied to our research, or not a model, but necessarily a bar. When we're thinking about research projects in medicine, we should also be thinking about how is this going to eventually scale.
So to get through a couple questions, let's just have one person respond to each question. So that way we can get a couple done. Questions from the audience? Go on, please.
Yeah, with millions more people having health insurance and the baseline policy requiring preventive care and more services, there were dire predictions about shortages of doctors in the future. And I wonder if you see it mobile in some way being a major way to address the coming doctor shortage. How can it substitute? How can it help to have the doctors that we
You
have
should answer that.
to provide more services?
So I'm the primary care guy in the room. And I'm too old and traditional to answer that without getting maniacal. So I don't really see it having that space. I don't really see that it's something that allows the years of training that go into trying to make reasonably intelligent decisions to be made without that brain in the room yet. We even have trouble with providers who have lesser training trying to do this well, because the fact of the matter is that human medicine is very, very complicated. And questions that may seem simple of someone who's coming in for a routine check actually may have catastrophic things going on that only a lot of training and a combination of intuition and experience helps you get at. So do I see an app getting in and significantly impacting that? Not really. Getting information out, for sure. Management, for sure. But is it going to replace that ability to do that, if that's what you're asking? I don't know. Go on.
Well, one of the things that I believe very strongly is with the changing pressure on providers now organized into ACOs, we're going to have the entire disease management industry decide that their customer is now the ACO.
What's ACO stand for? I'm sorry.
Accountable Care Act.
Oh, okay.
Accountable
Or,
Care
I'm
Organization.
sorry, Accountable Care Organization. My apologies.
So define it for them.
Okay, so basically, under the Accountable Care Act, the fundamental thing is changing from paying for specific services, inpatient, outpatient, follow-up physician, to basically for essentially an episode of care, providing a single reimbursement, and essentially saying to the providers that they really have to manage not just in the inpatient side, not just the physician practice, but they have to manage on a continuing basis. And that's a whole other seminar. But so the providers are woefully ill-equipped to do that. Now, there's been a disease management industry that has focused on primarily providing it to insurance companies and to various self-insured employers for years. And there are lots of guideline programs where they know how to work with people with diseases. They're not physicians. Oftentimes, they're clinicians. What I see happening is that two things. One, those entities, some of them multi-billion-dollar entities, are going to find a new customer called an ACO or a health provider. The second thing they're going to do is they are not going to build mobile apps. They are going to be the adopters of the best of breed mobile apps and integrate that into their disease management programs.
I would just push back a little bit, but before on Scott's, Dr. Stern's comment, except to say that, so Dr. Stern's company, Agile, specifically is trying to kind of empower folks with kind of the ability to diagnose. At least that was the premise that it began on. It's doing different things slightly now. But, so he knows a lot about this. So really you should weigh that much more heavily than what I'm about to say. So, but I would say that I think there is some potential to kind of give mid-level providers, so nurse practitioners, pharmacists, and other folks within kind of the chain of care, kind of superhuman strength, if you will, or superhuman powers, okay, by providing them with some of these tools. And it might just be incremental. And to Dr. Stern's comments, you might be able to make me, so I'm lousy with antibiotics, but if you give me the right app, you might actually be able to make me, do the right thing more of the time. So to that extent, I think you're going to, maybe I no longer need to call an infectious disease physician, okay? If you're interested in that, I've got a group working on that for the mobile app challenge. It's not my team, but connect you with that. But I think there is going to be some
I think you're right.
disruption there.
It just creates a visceral response, I'm afraid. Okay, one more question. Go ahead in the back, then we'll have to stop.
It's like the reality from those apps is they get downloaded. Even if they get downloaded, they're opened once for about 30 seconds and then never opened again. And so my question is, how do you encourage habitual usage of something like that?
Well, I mean, I'll take that for a second. Look, this goes back to what we've talked about, I think, before. What are you doing with this app? And if they've downloaded it, they've assessed it, and they've decided they don't want it, it goes beyond, it's not a mobile app problem, right? It's a business objective problem or a clinical objective problem, in large part, or a usability problem.
Right.
And you have to understand those things first, and then once you understand those problems, then you apply your methodology to the problem. But don't take it the other way around would be my guidance.
I would only add to that, this is when you develop these apps, because we did this with Agile, it's a constantly evolving process. So what happens is when the app gets out there, you have to have a well-defined user group, right, that you think is going to use this. It's targeted at someone. Then you have to define a group that's willing to look at it and vet it. And then you monitor how well they're using it, whether they're using it once or 10 times and how long for it. And you bring them back and you connect constantly to decide where is it when you're missing the boat. Why are you missing the boat? What are they looking for? Is this an interface problem, or have you really guessed wrong and there's really not the need that you would like? We should probably pause here. So I think we should thank our panelists for coming and talking with us.